So I'm going to tell you about the World Development Report, and when we have a chat with Fook, I can tell them more about what exactly the World Development Report is. But the problem that that we are trying to tackle here is what we call the middle income trap. Right? Essentially, these are countries that do reasonably well initially in the sense that they get to levels of per capita incomes of about 1,000, 1,500, and so on, and then start to sort of hit real headwinds. Right? Uh, so these are the middle income countries of the day. So you have about 75% of the population of the world now actually lives in a middle income country, um, and you see that uh, they have a GDP of about 40% of the world's uh, gross output, and then then if you look over here, you see that they have a fairly sizable share of the world's poor people, and these are extremely poor people, right? These are people who live on less than $2 a day, so about 60, 65, 66%, 63% or so, right? And then you've got the CO2 emissions. So these are countries that tend to use um, uh, uh, high carbon intensive fuels like coal, like oil, like gas, less gas than the other two. And so as a result, I think that these are super important countries, right? So in some sense, the progress of the world actually depends on these countries now. Right? If you look at their progress, actually, the progress has been very difficult, right? The median middle income economy, you see that it has an income less than a fifth that of the United States, right? But if you, the part that is really that's actually even more disconcerting is that that amount has roughly remained the same over the last 50 years, right? So these countries have not caught up to the United States, right? Now you have a few countries who are doing really well. Uh, the prime example of that is actually China, and you see that China has actually been catching up, and because of China, these countries as a whole also look like they're catching up. Okay, so the blue line there includes China, the red line there excludes China. Right. So these countries haven't really been doing particularly well. Now, the problem is that are things so are things getting better for these countries, or are things getting worse? Right. And one of the things that this World Development Report does is that it actually looks at the facts of this and says uh, that for two or three reasons, uh, there are these three facts that are somewhat disconcerting. The first is that as countries actually get to these higher levels of per capita income, uh, most of them actually slow down in growth, right? So these are the three exceptions that we have over here: Korea, Poland, and Chile. And they're very instructive in the sense that they've actually done some things that other middle income countries have not been able to. Right? What the report essentially says is that the prospects for those countries who have not become high income countries are actually getting worse. So that they will have slower growth as they reach as they grow into middle income. The problem is that they also have to make some structural changes, and it's going to get harder and harder for them to actually do that. And then the third thing, of course, is that because of changes in the world, because of growing pressures on them, especially if you're a large middle income country, it's going to get harder for you to actually do it as compared to these countries that grew at a time when things were relatively easy. Okay. All right. So let me, I'm trying to sort of do this quickly, but we've got over here are these three countries, three or four countries you see over here, So you have India there, which has just grown to just above $2,500 per capita. You have South Africa, which has really stagnated uh, between $4,000 and $6,000 per capita over the last 60 years, 50 years. And then you see over there that you see the growth of Brazil. Uh, Again, after a period of stagnation between in the 80s and the 90s, it is doing better. The exception here has been China, right? And so the thing that you have to sort of see is that uh, one way to think about it is to sort of abstract from India and China, because they have tended to be exceptions. They are exceptions both because of the size of their GDP, but they are also exceptions in terms of their trajectories, right? Especially China. Okay. Um, so what we try to do in this report is to sort of say, okay, what can these countries do? And the thing that we find is that the things that they have to do is sort of similar to the countries that went earlier. So if you look, for example, at South Korea followed a policy where they actually tried to get technologies from abroad. That's what we call infusion, right? You try to get these technologies from abroad and you try to infuse them into your economy. And then over time, you sort of switch. As you get closer and closer to the world technology frontier, you switch to greater innovation. That switch is not that easy. And one of the things that Korea did well was it used a couple of crises to actually sort of make those changes, right? One crisis was a political crisis, another crisis was a financial crisis, but it did that rather well. Okay. If you look at Poland, that was the other country that did rather well, right? And if you sort of see Poland, again, it did many of the same things as Korea. They really invested a lot in education. That's one of the things that you sort of see. All three of these countries sort of are real overachievers when it comes to education. Okay, Korea has one of the highest. So it has one of the highest rates. It has one of the highest rates of educational attainment. If you look at Poland, they also do rather well. They are in the top 10 in terms of education system, K through 12 education systems. And if you look at Chile, they also do rather well on this one. Beyond that, actually, things don't look that great for these countries in the sense that they do provide macro stability, all three of them. They do actually have fairly open economies. They do do an extraordinary job in accumulating human capital. But beyond that, you start to sort of see weaknesses, right? And so the first weakness that you sort of see is that in the case of Chile, for example, what you see is that Chile does a very good job in accumulating human capital, not that great a job in allocating human capital to tasks, right? So you have a very ossified social system that actually rewards your background much more than your ability. Okay, that's one. The second thing that all these countries, by the way, do, and this is something for you to actually keep in mind, is that none of them do very well on things related to the energy transition or the environment. Okay, Korea still uses a lot of coal. Poland still uses a lot of coal. Chile, because of the fact that it didn't have coal and oil and gas, ended up having to sort of do things like this. But again, that was not a thing that these countries ended up doing. Now you actually find that they are getting a lot of pressure to do things on. They are getting they are being pressured, especially the Indias and the Indonesias and the Chinas and others. They are being pressured to actually do things on this one. So it's tough enough for them to grow, just like Korea and all did. In addition, they'll have a lot more of problems, right? And they're going to be facing basically three problems. The first one is, like I said, it's really hard to grow to think. So the first one is that they will start to see this structural slowdown in the sense that you grow to so as you get closer to the US, not to US per capita incomes, but 20% of US per capita incomes, you start to sort of slow down. Okay. The other thing that you see is that that you do have some countries that actually do better than others. The countries that do better are the ones that actually provide more economic freedom for their enterprises, for their people, and so on. But it turns out that actually the way that you sort of see things changing in places like Turkey and so on is that you're actually moving the other way, right? The third thing, of course, is that you have to start to sort of shift from capital accumulation and more effort to actually much more to actually increase productivity, and that's easier said than done. Okay. Now, the other thing that is happening in these countries is that that they are facing these pressures, right? Which the first is that Chile, Korea, and Poland actually grew in circumstances of world trade that were much better than what the countries now have, and things are likely to get worse, right? So the first thing that you sort of see over here is that the amount of harmful trade policies is actually outpacing the helpful ones. And so I could show you another chart that actually shows that it's the advanced economies and the larger middle income countries that are the worst offenders. Okay? So they are actually doing, they are creating a much more harmful environment for the countries that are smaller middle income economies. For the smaller middle income economies, it's especially important that they have access to foreign markets, to foreign technologies, and so on. For the Indias and Chinas, it is important, but because they have a large market themselves, at least the market part is not that important. It's much more the technology part, right? But then you take a look at the second chart, and you sort of see that here this is the effect of the carbon border adjustment mechanism of the EU. And here's one scenario. You see that the countries that sort of gain from that are countries like the United States as well as the EU. The countries that lose from that are India, China, and the middle income countries of Africa. So things are getting so if you have carbon border adjustment mechanisms being copied by other countries and so on, things are going to get harder for these countries, not easier. Okay. Now, fortunately, there are things that have been happening in the world of academics that actually provide some answers for what these countries can do, right? And the people who've been working on those things, going back to Joseph Schumpeter and creative destruction, but also people like Philippe Aghion and Peter Howitt, and then the next generation of those who are doing even better work, I think, than the first two are people like Ufuk. Okay, so there is a reason why Ufuk was drafted for this report. We enticed him to actually work on this, and we are. So I think that's going to be the success factor of this report, in the sense that you know the work that they've been doing, the new Schumpeterian theories of creative destruction and so on, we think are especially pertinent for these countries. Okay, if they want to grow to high income within decades rather than centuries. Okay, and so we have a report that is in 3 parts. The first part looks at the analysis. The first part I just talked about are the facts. The second part actually looks at the analysis, and what this analysis does is it actually makes us think somewhat differently about these things, right? We have these firmly held beliefs, for example, that big firms are bad and small firms are good. Big firms tend to block innovation. New firms tend to bring innovation, and so on. That gets that view starts to get qualified in these new theories, right? And so these new theories tend to be much more agnostic when it comes to things like firm size and distribution. Large firms could be good, they could be bad. Small firms could be good, they could be bad. So you have to sort of look much more deeply into this. The way to sort of focus on the right things is to sort of look at the value added of these firms rather than their size or their sort of their superficial characteristics. You have to look more deeply into their structures. The other thing that you have to look at is that we've tended to sort of focus a lot on income distribution. In part, these countries focus on they focus on income distributions because when they compared unsuccessful middle-income countries in Latin America mostly, as compared to the successful middle-income countries in East Asia mostly, the ones in East Asia tended to have much lower levels of income inequality when they got to high income. They kept inequality down. The ones in Latin America tended not to be able to do that. Okay? And so as a result, they of course focused on this as a causal factor, or at least a factor that could slow things down. And what we sort of say is that's not really the thing to look at. You have to look more deeply, actually. Income inequality could be bad, it could be good, but what you really need to sort of look at is socioeconomic mobility, right? Now, so as you go from things like size and age of a firm to the value added of a firm, as you go from static income inequality to things like social mobility, it gets harder to measure these things, okay? So which means that the data demands of these new theories are actually much greater, okay? And here's where actually we are very concerned, because there are lots of countries that are actually going in the wrong direction when it comes to data, in the sense of rather than providing better data to people who are researching this or people who are making business decisions based on the data, things are getting actually worse in a whole lot of these countries, right? I don't want to name any country right now, but I think you can guess, okay? So, and the third part, of course, is that there is this new religion, which is that, you know, that we should just sort of stop using fossil fuels, and so we want middle-income countries to engage in this experiment to actually grow to high income without fossil fuels, when no country has ever done that. Okay, and so the question then is that a realistic thing or not? And one of the things that the report tries to sort of do is that, you know, while it's relatively easy to measure from which source you are getting your energy, right? Are you getting it from coal? Are you getting it from gas? Are you getting it from oil? Are you getting it from hydro, renewables? That's relatively easy. You can actually get that data from everywhere. What's not easy is what is happening to GHG emissions. Almost done. Yeah. Okay. And so what we were saying that what you really need to do is you really need to start to focus much more on GHG emissions, because that's the emergency. It's not so much whether or not you're using fossil fuels or not. That thing could be good or bad, right? What really is bad are GHG emissions. So that's what you really want to look at. And the thing that as you sort of shift from a focus on those things to these things, you actually start to focus on many things that are very important that you would miss otherwise. And one of them is energy efficiency. So if you sort of look at the debate right now on climate action and so on, you don't hear a lot about energy efficiency. Okay? The amounts of emissions per unit of GDP, for example. That's there, but it's the background. Okay? So one of the things that we try to sort of do in this report is it's really a matter of efficiency. Okay? So you want to sort of make sure that you use your capital efficiently. You want to make sure that you use your talent efficiently, and then you want to make sure that you use your energy efficiently. Okay? So the main difference between middle-income countries and countries that the kind of economies they aspire to is that they are less efficient. Okay? And so the focus here is much more. On efficiency. I'm out of time, right? Okay. So I'm going to stop at one slide here, so we have lots of really nice work in the report. You'll be able to see it pretty soon. And what I want to sort of say is that you've got these sort of 2 or 3 so, you know, here's the problem, right? The problem is that when you think about Schumpeterian creative destruction, you find that the forces of preservation in these countries are very strong. Okay? You find that the forces of creation are there, right? And they need to be nurtured and so on. But the forces of destruction tend to be very, very weak. Okay? And what we sort of so essentially, what these countries really have to do is that they have to make a miracle. Okay, so we actually took that from a paper that Bob Lucas wrote back in '93. Okay, and if they make that miracle, these forces would look something like this. So these forces would be in balance, essentially, right? And for them to be able to do this, we say that these are the sort of things that they have to do. And this is based on both the theory as well as the experience, not just of the successful countries, but also the less successful ones. I'm going to stop.